At dawn, 2 clocks began to tick, one in Washington, cold and merciless, demanding that a small nation surrender 60% of its gold and oil within 48 hours or be cut from the lifeline of the dollar. The other in Ouagadougou, signed not with fear but with fire, granting 72 hours for foreign operators to comply with new national law or leave the fields, the rigs, the pipelines behind. It was not negotiation. It was collision between leverage and law, between control and resistance. For the people of Burkina Faso, this ultimatum was not just about numbers. It was about soil that had been tilled by generations, about resources carried under calloused hands, about dignity refused and reclaimed. Ibrahim Traoré did not step onto the world stage with a speech. He set a clock, a countdown not just for his country, but for Africa itself. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and walk with us, because this story is still being written, hour by hour. The question hangs: when 2 clocks strike at once, which one commands the future? The ultimatum did not arrive with ceremony. It came as a blunt directive from Washington. 48 hours, surrender 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil, or the arteries of finance would be cut. No room for dialogue, no diplomatic courtesies, only the harsh language of sanctions and exclusion. In past decades, such a message might have forced a quiet signature under pressure. But in 2022, the response from Ouagadougou carried a different weight. Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier president, had already begun to redraw the map of his nation's sovereignty. Before the American clock even started, foreign military privileges were rolled back, mining contracts re-examined, non-compliant operators removed. Security at the sites had been brought under national command. IT servers were moved into domestic custody. These were not gestures. They were switches flipped, levers of power that could be pulled in an instant. When the demand from Washington landed, Traoré did not scramble. He activated. The 72-hour order was not a speech. It was a legal and operational command. Freeze exports, audit every mine, replace foreign security teams, seize control of data, repatriate oversight. Within minutes, couriers carried sealed packets to company offices. Phones rang in the capital. At checkpoints, trucks were halted, manifests scrutinized. What once flowed unquestioned now faced scrutiny line by line. At a gold site in the north, an IT manager refused to hand over server keys. A state officer responded not with argument, but with a suspension notice, stamped and signed. Credentials changed hands. Data rerouted into secure nodes. Elsewhere, drones circled perimeters, cataloging stockpiles from the air. A convoy attempted to force its way through at dusk, but was stopped cold at a roadblock, escorted back under guard. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer an economy governed abroad. It was the assertion of domestic law, applied in real time. Markets and villages felt the tremors. In courtyards and bus stations, radios crackled with updates. One operator complied, another hesitated, a third threatened to leave. People gathered around the broadcasts, realizing this was not theory. It was enforcement, hour by hour. Anxiety grew, but so did pride. The sight of national officers standing firm against global companies was itself a statement. In the ministries, the order triggered audits, seizures of suspicious transfers, dismissals of officials tied to foreign contracts. Sabotage struck a fuel depot, contained swiftly, but enough to confirm that resistance would not remain on paper. The 72-hour order was already testing every system, legal, financial, and human. Yet it was holding, supported by the authority of the presidency and the resilience of communities. The stakes could not have been higher. To the outside world, this looked like brinkmanship, a gamble against overwhelming odds. To Burkina Faso, it was survival through dignity. Traoré was not improvising. He was planting a flag. The resources of this land would no longer be bartered away under duress. And so, 2 clocks ran in parallel. One set in Washington, one in Ouagadougou. The tension was not abstract. It was measured in halted trucks, frozen accounts, and guarded stockpiles. Every hour marked a deeper test of will. The soil had been sown with defiance, and the first shoots of a new order began to break through. Whose clock will strike first? The foreign demand or the sovereign decree? Hour 6. The order was live, and the first ripples spread across Burkina Faso's gold belt. Operators stared at stamped directives. Security teams found themselves replaced overnight. Couriers moved with sealed packets as if carrying the pulse of a nation. But behind the procedural language of audits and compliance, the atmosphere was electric, almost combustible. This was no simulation. It was the rewriting of economic law in real time. Resistance came quickly. At one mining site, a manager flatly refused to grant state officers access to company servers. The answer was met not with negotiation, but with the delivery of a suspension order, effective immediately. Data channels switched within minutes, rerouted through secure servers in Ouagadougou. No shouting, no violence, just the quiet force of authority. Authority claimed, not requested. Elsewhere, drones patrolled the perimeter of stockpiles, logging quantities from the air. One convoy tried to press forward under the old system of manifests, but was stopped and escorted back under guard. The message spread fast. The rules had already changed. As hours passed, compliance grew. But so did friction. 2 foreign operators signed the new agreements under pressure, while another threatened withdrawal. Villagers and miners listened to radios in the markets, hearing updates hour by hour. The 72-hour order ceased to feel like a government decree. It began to feel like a lived reality. Yet beneath the enforcement, unease simmered. Would this hold when the 48-hour cutoff from Washington struck? By the second night, sabotage arrived. A fire ignited at a fuel depot, quickly contained, but investigators uncovered traces of deliberate tampering. Within the ministries, 2 officials were dismissed after suspicious financial transfers linked to foreign demand. The struggle was no longer only external, it was also internal. A test of loyalty within the very institutions tasked with upholding sovereignty. And yet resilience deepened. Miners began guarding stockpiles through the night. Village elders opened radio channels to relay alerts directly to the capital. Young engineers transformed off-the-shelf drones into an improvised surveillance net. The early warning system was crude, but it worked. Green, yellow, and red markers lit up the control room as compliance, resistance, and review were tracked in real time. By hour 20, a pattern was clear. Compliance zones spread, resistance shrank, but the looming shadow of the foreign deadline drew closer. The American demand was not idle. Test transfers through New York began to fail. Banks reported blocked channels. The first signs of the 48-hour strike point materialized. Cash flow drying up, arteries constricted. Inside the presidential compound, Traoré met his advisors. Reports were brutal. Blocked payments confirmed, operators hesitating, sabotage attempts multiplying. But alongside the setbacks were small victories. Domestic banks processed regional trades. Barter in gold began clearing through Sahel partners. Villages themselves guarded depots, proving that sovereignty was not merely an edict from above, but an act sustained from below. By hour 45, tension in Ouagadougou was palpable. Radio frequencies carried 2 narratives: foreign outlets declaring collapse, and national broadcasts insisting the transition to state control was on track. Markets trembled. Shopkeepers counted smaller piles of cash. Truck drivers idled at checkpoints, caught between contracts of yesterday and the orders of today. The city itself seemed suspended between 2 futures. Then came hour 48, the moment of collision. Banks confirmed frozen transfers. Wire systems stalled. A major foreign consortium suspended operations, waiting for Washington's verdict. Prices of food and fuel rose in the streets. Foreign headlines proclaimed imminent default. The weight of the ultimatum pressed like a stone upon every citizen. Yet Traoré did not bend. He ordered emergency stipends released in gold-backed credits, wages continued in mining towns, and convoys rerouted through Sahel banks. Crude, imperfect, but functioning. Foreign media mocked the move as primitive. On the ground, miners cheered, not because they were enriched, but because they were still working. Hour 50 marked a new phase. 2 clocks now struck not as symbols but as weapons. The 48-hour demand had cut deep. The 72-hour order had not broken. Burkina Faso balanced on a knife's edge, waiting to see whether dignity could outlast the chokehold of finance. At hour 48, whose truth will prevail? The collapse announced abroad, or the resilience built at home? The first consequence was silence, the kind that fills markets when cash runs short. Shopkeepers raised prices overnight. Taxi drivers refused long trips, worried that fuel would vanish before dawn. Miners waited uneasily for wages, fearing that without dollars, pay would stop altogether. The 48-hour strike from Washington was designed precisely for this, to choke circulation until panic set in. But Burkina Faso did not fold. Instead, a blunt but decisive remedy emerged. The government authorized emergency stipends paid not in blocked currencies, but in gold-backed credits redeemable locally. Primitive foreign media sneered. Yet in the mining towns, the gesture landed like a lifeline. A miner in Kaya held his payslip and told a reporter, "At least we are still working." For him and thousands like him, it was not luxury that mattered, but continuity. Across villages, the adjustment was raw but inventive. Convoys rerouted through Sahel partners delivered grain and medicine. Local radio stations became lifelines, broadcasting where supplies would arrive and which roads remained open. Youths turned cheap drones into eyes in the sky, alerting communities of suspicious movements. It was sovereignty lived through improvisation. Messy, fragile, yet undeniably real. Inside the ministries, the effects ran deeper. Officials compromised by suspicious transfers were removed. New oversight systems were launched, centralizing export logs and repatriating sensitive data. What began as a defensive measure against foreign ultimatum became a sweeping cleanup of domestic governance. The message grew louder. The soil of Burkina Faso would not be leased to others without consequence. Still, the pain was visible. Families counted fewer coins at the market stalls. Imported goods slowed, queues lengthened, inflation climbed. The nation endured what looked, from outside, like collapse. And yet within, resilience hardened. Villagers guarded stockpiles through the night, treating resources not as commodities to be extracted, but as treasures to be defended. This moment became more than an economic standoff. It became a cultural and political awakening. Conversations in tea shops turned on the same phrase, "If we can endure this, we can endure more." The ordeal stitched together a sense of unity across class and region. Sovereignty ceased to be a distant slogan and became a daily discipline. For Traoré, the confrontation crystallized a philosophy. He told his advisors bluntly, "This is a sovereignty test. If companies cannot operate under our law, they will not operate here." His words echoed across Ouagadougou, replayed on local broadcasts, repeated in markets and bus stops. The ultimatum was no longer framed as Washington versus one man. It had become Burkina Faso against the weight of dependency itself. And in that defiance, a broader vision began to surface. Commentators across the continent linked the 72-hour stand to a larger wave. No longer simply the politics of one nation, it felt like the front line of anti-colonial Africa, a rejection of the new forms of economic submission dressed as partnership. Each halted convoy, each rerouted wire, each pay slip stamped in gold-backed credit, all of it became symbols of a continent's voice breaking through silence. Short-term pain was undeniable. Medium-term outcomes remained uncertain, but for the first time in decades, the people of Burkina Faso felt that they were choosing difficulty rather than accepting imposition. It was hardship, yes, but hardship claimed, not imposed. The clash revealed fractures, too. Some citizens quietly questioned how long resilience could last. Would local credits hold value if foreign banks continued to block reserves? Would the Sahel alliance remain committed if pressure intensified? These questions lingered in the capital, whispers mixing with cheers. Sovereignty was inspiring but fragile. As the clock advanced beyond the 50th hour, the strain grew heavier, but so did pride. No one could deny the toll. Prices, shortages, anxiety. Yet no one could deny the resolve either. It was as if the nation's heartbeat had synced with the ticking of the 72-hour clock. Each passing hour became proof of survival, proof that the ultimatum was not breaking the people, but welding them together. Will dignity survive when the dollar does not flow? Or will the chokehold prove stronger than the will to stand? Beyond Ouagadougou, the world watched with sharpened eyes. To Washington, the confrontation was a test of financial dominance. Dollar channels were switched off, wire transfers frozen, and international headlines declared that Burkina Faso was spiraling toward collapse. Analysts spoke of default. Traders speculated against the currency, and commentators framed the 72-hour order as little more than defiance doomed to fail. Yet on the ground, a different current began to move. From Bamako and Niamey came a joint declaration. Mali and Niger would not allow Burkina Faso to face the siege alone. Convoys loaded with grain, fuel, and medicine rolled toward the border, guarded by soldiers, cheered by villagers. Cameras captured Ibrahim Traoré standing shoulder to shoulder with Sahel leaders as the first trucks crossed into Burkina Faso. No speeches, no flags, only presence. The silence itself became a statement that a united Sahel could turn isolation into shield. This shift altered the international narrative. What had been portrayed as a lonely standoff now looked like the first step toward regional solidarity. Commentators who had dismissed Burkina Faso's defiance began recalculating. If the Sahel bloc could create an alternative circuit of trade, if gold and regional currencies could substitute for blocked dollars, then the 48-hour ultimatum was not an irresistible force, but a challenge that could be resisted. European outlets debated the implications. Was this the emergence of a parallel financial corridor outside the dollar's reach? Could other African nations, weary of similar pressures, follow the model? Suddenly, the risk seemed not only to Burkina Faso, but to the architecture of external control itself. In the corridors of power, the language of collapse gave way to caution. Would pressing harder drive the Sahel deeper into unity? Would sanctions achieve compliance, or would they accelerate the building of a new order? The questions themselves marked a shift. No longer was the narrative controlled by Washington alone. For Africans watching abroad, the moment carried symbolic weight. Images of convoys rolling under armed escort, of communities cheering their arrival, resonated far beyond borders. It was not merely Burkina Faso's resilience on display. It was the spirit of African sovereignty, a demonstration that even under blockade, nations could find strength in each other. The international community stood at a crossroads. To one side lay the continuation of pressure, isolation, and sanctions. To the other lay the recognition that a new bloc was forming, one that would not bow easily to the old hierarchies. What happens when isolation turns into alliance? When a nation once expected to break becomes the cornerstone of a regional shield? By the 70th hour, the countdown no longer felt like a path to collapse. It felt like the unveiling of something larger. A new line of sovereignty, written not in treaties, but in convoys of grain, credits stamped in gold, and people willing to defend their soil. The ultimatum that began as a threat now appeared as a turning point. Yet the question lingered. What future would this defiance carve? The risks remain formidable. Foreign sanctions could extend, cutting not only financial arteries but trade routes and partnerships far beyond the Sahel. Western investors may continue their withdrawal, creating gaps in development projects and energy supplies. International media, still skeptical, may frame every setback as proof of failure. And within Burkina Faso, inflation and shortages could test patience and unity. Sovereignty may inspire, but hardship endured too long can fracture even the strongest resolve. Still, opportunities gleam through the uncertainty. The Sahel Alliance has proven its capacity to mobilize resources quickly and visibly. If this cooperation matures, it could lay the foundation for a regional economic corridor insulated from external dictates. Gold-backed trade, local currencies, and barter arrangements may appear clumsy today, but each transaction builds experience, capacity, and confidence. And from these fragile beginnings, sturdier institutions could emerge. For Burkina Faso itself, the 72-hour stand has already redefined governance. National oversight of mines and oil fields is no longer theory, but practice. Citizens have witnessed that law can be enforced not only downward but outward, upon foreign corporations once seen as untouchable. This shift is psychological as much as political. Sovereignty is no longer abstract, it is lived. The road forward will demand more than endurance. It will require strategy, diversification of partners, investment in domestic capacity, and a careful balance between asserting dignity and avoiding unnecessary isolation. If pursued wisely, the confrontation could become a catalyst for long-term transformation, where sovereignty is not defended only in crisis, but cultivated in daily governance. And yet, perhaps the greatest legacy is symbolic. Across Africa, voices now echo. If one small, landlocked nation can resist, what stops the rest? The answer is not guaranteed, but the question itself is powerful. It suggests that the 72-hour order was not only Burkina Faso's gamble, but Africa's new chapter. Is this merely the survival of one nation, or the first step toward a continent that writes its own future without ultimatum? Hour 72 arrived not with collapse, but with celebration. Markets reopened. Radios played victory songs. Children waved flags in the streets of Ouagadougou. What foreign headlines had framed as inevitable failure dissolved into noise. The 48-hour demand had passed, leaving behind disruption, but not defeat. In its place stood a new foundation, a 72-hour order transformed into law. Ibrahim Traoré addressed his people with words both simple and unshakable. We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up and we made it real. In that declaration, the essence of the struggle was clear. Sovereignty was not a gift granted from abroad. It was a discipline enforced day by day, hour by hour, until the soil, the gold, and the oil were claimed as the rightful inheritance of the people. The significance extended beyond borders. Across the Sahel, Mali and Niger stood not as neighbors watching from the sidelines, but as partners in survival. Their convoys, their grain, their fuel, all became symbols of a region that refused to break apart under pressure. The image of three leaders standing side by side at the border told the world that isolation could be rewritten as alliance. For the rest of Africa, the implications ripple outward. If Burkina Faso could resist a demand to surrender 60% of its resources, what might others achieve if they too refused? If sanctions could not collapse a small, landlocked nation in 72 hours, then perhaps the architecture of control was weaker than it appeared. This was more than a national stand. It was a chapter in the story of anti-colonial Africa, a reminder that the shadows of dependency need not last forever. Challenges will continue. Foreign pressure will not vanish overnight. But each convoy that crossed the border, each miner paid in gold-backed credit, each village that guarded its depot, all of it together has etched a new truth into history. Sovereignty is not theory. It is practice. It is action. It is survival transformed into defiance, and defiance transformed into dignity. This is the image the world now sees, not of a continent bowed, but of African sovereignty rising in plain view. And so the question endures. If Burkina Faso can endure 72 hours against the weight of empires, what might Africa build in 72 years? If this story resonates with your sense of justice, do not leave it here. Subscribe, share,